The year was 1305, and London was alive with its usual summer noise. The clatter of hooves against cobblestones, the cries of merchants hawking bread and salted fish, the stink of tallow smoke and horse dung carried by the wind. Yet beneath this ordinary hum of medieval life, there was an electric tension, as if the entire city were holding its breath. On this August morning, the streets would not echo only with the sounds of commerce, but with something darker, the collective roar of a crowd summoned to witness one of the most infamous executions in English history. The condemned was not some nameless thief or outlaw dragged from Newgate's festering cells. He was William Wallace, the rebel knight of Scotland, whose very name had become a thunderclap across the northern kingdom. For years he had defied the might of England, humbling armies that seemed invincible. He had turned fields into charnel grounds for English knights, daring to believe that a people long divided by clan and crown could rise against the foreign yoke. To some, Wallace was no more than a murderer and brigand. To others, he was the living embodiment of Scotland's dream of freedom. To Edward I, he was something far more dangerous, an idea. And ideas, as Edward well knew, had to be killed slowly. The execution that London prepared for was not a mere killing, not a clean stroke of sword or axe. It was spectacle, designed with a precision that was almost theatrical. The punishment, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was reserved for the crime of high treason, and in the medieval imagination there was no worse offense. To betray the king was to tear at the very fabric of Christendom's divinely ordained order. The guilty must not only die, they must be annihilated, stripped of dignity, denied humanity, and remade into a warning that would sear itself into the memory of all who watched. Crowds gathered early, pouring into the heart of the city from hamlets and villages miles away. They came not merely out of loyalty to their king, but for the grim excitement of the spectacle itself. Medieval executions were communal events, almost festivals of death. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, vendors hawked ale and roasted meat, and minstrels wove songs about the rebels' crimes. The atmosphere was carnival and courtroom, punishment and entertainment all at once. The people were not passive witnesses, but participants, their jeers and curses summoned like a chorus to reinforce the message of royal authority. But this was no ordinary traitor. Wallace's presence magnified the day into something mythic. Many in the crowd had heard stories of his defiance, of how he had humbled English cavalry at Stirling Bridge, how he had cut down nobles who once thought themselves untouchable, how he had eluded capture for nearly a decade, despite the full weight of Edward's kingdom bearing down upon him. To see such a man brought low promised a satisfaction rare in a world where kings and rebels seemed remote figures. Here, on this very day, Londoners could gape upon the downfall of a legend. Yet even as the crowd anticipated his humiliation, a certain unease lingered. Wallace's fate had already been mythologized in whispers, shaped by both fear and admiration. Some recalled how the Welsh rebel prince Daffy ap Grediffy had met the same gruesome end only 2 decades earlier, shrieking on the scaffold as England made its lesson plain. Others muttered that to destroy Wallace so savagely might elevate him into martyrdom, turning his death into a fire that no English sword could extinguish. For Edward I, however, there was no ambiguity. Known to history as Longshanks for his towering height and relentless will, he had orchestrated Wallace's punishment with deliberate cruelty. Edward was a king who understood the power of symbols. He had expelled the Jews from England, crushed Wales into submission, and declared himself overlord of Scotland. Rebellion, in his eyes, was not simply disobedience, but contagion. To kill Wallace was not enough. His body must be paraded, degraded, torn apart piece by piece so that all of Britain, and indeed all of Europe, would remember what awaited those who defied the crown. The morning light poured across London's timbered houses and crooked lanes, gilding them in deceptive warmth. From the Tower, where Wallace had been held in grim silence, to Smithfield, where the scaffold had been raised, the city bristled with anticipation. Wooden platforms were built for the richer spectators, while the poor pressed against the barriers, jostling for a view. Children played at mock executions in the alleys, shrinking up cats or crows, mimicking the fate of the rebel they had yet to see. Ale flowed freely, gossip spread like wildfire. Some claimed Wallace would weep for mercy, others swore he would curse Edward to his last breath. But no one, not the judges who condemned him, not the executioner sharpening his blades, not even Edward himself, knew exactly how Wallace would face the end. That uncertainty was the final hook, the element that drew London's citizens from their beds at dawn to watch a man's destruction. For in a world where death was commonplace, how one died mattered as much as how one had lived. And so the stage was set. A city of nearly 80,000 souls turned its gaze on one man. A rebel knight, bound and broken, yet still carrying the weight of a nation's hopes, was about to be unmade in fire and blood. What was to come was not execution, but annihilation, a ritual designed not only to destroy William Wallace, but to cauterize the very idea of Scotland's freedom. The crowd leaned forward as the distant clatter of hooves and wheels echoed from the Tower. The condemned was coming, and with him, history. To understand why William Wallace was condemned to such brutal a death, one must first return to the soil that shaped him, Scotland in the closing decades of the 13th century. It was not yet the Scotland of later centuries, bound tightly under a single crown and national myth. Instead, it was a land of clans and rivalries, of castles perched on windswept crags and loyalties that shifted with the winds of survival. Here, identity was fragile, fractured between Gaelic traditions, Norman feudal lords, and the ceaseless pressure of a powerful southern neighbor. The crisis that birthed Wallace's rebellion began not with a battle, but with a death. In 1286, King Alexander III of Scotland fell from his horse one stormy night while riding along the coast of Fife. His sudden death left the kingdom without a direct heir, for his children had all predeceased him. The only surviving descendant was his infant granddaughter, Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway. Before she could take the throne, however, the child herself died on her voyage to Scotland. With her death, the royal bloodline was severed, and Scotland plunged into what became known as the Great Cause, a succession crisis that opened the door for English intervention. Edward I of England, already eyeing the northern kingdom as his next conquest, was invited to arbitrate the dispute among the rival Scottish claimants. It was a fateful invitation. Under the guise of impartiality, Edward demanded that all Scottish nobles acknowledge him as overlord before he would render judgment. Many complied, perhaps believing it a temporary submission, but in doing so, they handed Edward the foothold he desired. In 1292, he installed John Balliol as King of Scotland, but not as a sovereign ruler. Balliol was reduced to little more than a vassal, a puppet whose strings Edward tugged from Westminster. The Scots soon grew resentful of their humiliated monarch, and by 1296, Edward's heavy-handed demands, taxes for his wars in France, forced levies of soldiers, sparked rebellion. When Balliol dared to resist, Edward invaded. His army stormed through Berwick, slaughtering thousands in a massacre that turned the River Tweed red with blood. The Stone of Destiny, symbol of Scottish kingship, was torn from Scone Abbey and carried off to Westminster, where it would rest beneath the coronation throne of England's monarchs. To Edward, it was more than spoils. It was the visible proof that Scotland's independence was broken. But if Scotland's nobility bent, its common people seethed. English garrisons occupied castles, their soldiers demanding tribute from farmers already stretched thin by poor harvests. Land was confiscated, rents raised, and trade restricted to favor English merchants. The resentment grew not just from political subjugation, but from daily indignities, a tax collector's sneer, a soldier's rough hand in the marketplace, the knowledge that one's own king had knelt to another. It was in this crucible of humiliation that William Wallace emerged. Unlike the high-born magnates who played their dangerous games of allegiance, Wallace was of minor nobility, landed, but far from wealthy. His upbringing was steeped in both hardship and martial discipline. Chronicles suggest he lost close kin to English violence, though the details are cloaked in legend. Whether through personal grief or simple outrage at oppression, Wallace's heart burned with a fury that nobles could compromise away, but men like him could not. The Wallace who first appeared in history was no politician, no court intriguer. He was a swordsman, a guerrilla fighter. In 1297, he struck at Lanark, killing the English sheriff William Heselrigg. This was no mere skirmish. It was a signal. The slaying of an English official was a direct challenge to Edward's authority, and it ignited the spark of rebellion. Men flocked to Wallace's banner, not because he promised riches or titles, but because he embodied resistance. Here was a man willing to strike back when others submitted. Scotland at that moment teetered between submission and defiance. The nobles, many already sworn to Edward, hesitated. But the common folk, the crofters, the smiths, the dispossessed, saw in Wallace a leader who would not compromise. His rebellion was as much about identity as it was about politics. To follow Wallace was to reclaim dignity. Yet this defiance came at extraordinary cost. The English crown viewed every raid, every ambush, not as warfare, but as banditry, punishable by fire and sword. Villages suspected of harboring Wallace's men were burned, their inhabitants slaughtered as examples. Still, the rebel knight endured, gathering strength. In a land where loyalties were often bought or broken, his refusal to yield was his greatest weapon. What Wallace represented was more dangerous than armies or castles. He represented the possibility that Scotland need not accept Edward's yoke, that a man of no great birth could rally his people to stand against the greatest military power of the age. This was the seed of nationhood, fragile, still undefined, but rooted in defiance. And Edward knew it. Rebellion, he believed, was a fire. It began as a flicker, but if left unchecked, it spread across borders, across generations. To him, Wallace was not merely a rebel knight. He was a blaze that could ignite Scotland itself. Thus, from the political vacuum left by Alexander's death, from the humiliation of John Balliol's reign, and from the anger of ordinary Scots ground down under English boots, rose William Wallace, the rebel who would become both a nightmare for England and a legend for his own people. By the late summer of 1297, the name William Wallace had already begun to circulate in whispers. His ambushes and raids had embarrassed English garrisons, but to Edward's administrators, he was still no more than a thorn in the side, a bandit leader with limited reach. That illusion shattered on the banks of the River Forth. Stirling Bridge was the kind of battle that should never have been won. The English hosts, commanded by John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, and Hugh de Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland, outnumbered Wallace's forces by thousands. They were armored knights, mounted on great war horses, supported by infantry drilled in continental tactics. Wallace's men, by contrast, were poorly equipped. Many were peasants with spears and farm tools. Few had mail. Fewer still owned horses. By every conventional measure, it should have been a slaughter. But Wallace and his co-commander, Andrew Murray of Murray, understood something their opponents did not. Terrain could be sharper than any sword. The River Forth was crossed by a narrow timbered bridge, barely wide enough for 2 horsemen abreast. To push an army across it was to bottleneck them, to strip the English of their one decisive advantage, mobility. When the English began their crossing, Wallace waited. His men were hidden in marshy ground on the far side of the bridge. Impatient, Surrey's forces moved in waves, filing across slowly, never in full strength on the northern bank. It was then that Wallace struck. Like a trap snapping shut, the Scots surged forward, spears leveled, cutting down knights before they could even deploy. The English, caught between the Scots ahead and the river behind, panicked. Horses stumbled in the mud, men fell into the Forth and drowned under the weight of their armor. Cressingham himself was cut down, his bloated body later flayed by the Scots, in an act of vengeance so visceral it would echo in English memory for decades. It was not merely a victory, it was humiliation. Against all odds, Wallace and Murray had destroyed an English army, and with it the illusion of Edward's invincibility. Word spread like wildfire. Across Scotland, peasants and townsmen who had resigned themselves to English rule now saw proof that defiance was possible. Wallace was no longer just a guerrilla leader, he was a symbol. The aftermath of Stirling Bridge was brutal. English garrisons across central Scotland fell or fled. Wallace's forces surged south, raiding as far as the borderlands, sending refugees streaming into England. Chroniclers describe burning villages, fields stripped bare, livestock driven away, a taste of the devastation the Scots themselves had long endured under Edward's campaigns. Wallace was elected Guardian of Scotland in the name of the absent King John Balliol, a title that placed him, astonishingly, at the head of the kingdom's resistance. Yet, for all the triumph, Stirling carried a shadow. Andrew Murray, Wallace's ally and perhaps the more experienced commander, was mortally wounded in the battle. His death left Wallace without a partner who might have balanced his uncompromising ferocity. Alone, Wallace would carry the weight of the rebellion on his shoulders, and in doing so, he became not only a leader, but also a marked man. In England, the reaction was of disbelief and fury. Edward I, campaigning in France at the time, returned with grim resolve. He had seen rebellions before, in Wales and Gascony, and he knew the danger of allowing an upstart to become a legend. He would not permit another man to carve out a power base on the fringes of his kingdom. Wallace, Edward declared, would be hunted until the very memory of his defiance was erased. The Battle of Stirling Bridge was more than a clash of arms. It was a turning point in the psychology of both nations. For the Scots, it proved that English heavy cavalry, the terror of medieval battlefields, could be beaten. For the English crown, it was an insult,
a reminder that fear was not enough to keep a conquered people subdued. And in Wallace himself, it lit a fire that would define the years to come. No longer a shadowy rebel striking from forests and hills, he now bore the mantle of Scotland's resistance, a leader whose victories had awakened hope. But in awakening that hope, he also painted a target on his back. From that day onward, Wallace ceased to be just a man. He was a threat to an empire.
To understand why William Wallace's fate was so terrible, we must understand the man who ordered it, Edward I of England, remembered by his people as a lawgiver and conqueror, and by his enemies as Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots. Edward was born in 1239, the son of Henry III, a king plagued by baronial revolts and weak authority. From a young age, Edward absorbed lessons in the fragility of power. He watched his father humiliated by rebellious nobles, saw how quickly loyalty could dissolve, and came to believe that kingship was secured not by affection, but by fear. When he inherited the throne in 1272, he resolved that no subject, no rival kingdom, would ever threaten England's authority again. Edward was tall, well over 6 feet, and imposing in both presence and personality. Chroniclers describe him as hot-tempered, tireless in war, and relentless towards enemies. He was a man of contradictions, deeply pious, yet merciless, a reformer of English law, yet brutal in the application of justice. He carried within him the iron certainty that kings ruled by divine right, and that rebellion against the crown was rebellion against God himself. He proved this first in Wales. The princes of Gwynedd had long resisted English dominance. Hiding in their mountain fortresses, raiding the marshes, Edward launched campaign after campaign, constructing a ring of massive stone castles, Carnarvon, Conway, Harlech, that still stand as monuments to his determination. When the last native prince, David ap Gruffydd, rebelled in 1282, Edward had him captured and sentenced to the same punishment that would later befall Wallace: hanging, drawing, and quartering. David's execution was the first recorded use of that method in England, and it set the precedent for how Edward dealt with those who dared to claim independence. Edward also left his mark on England's own people. In 1290, he expelled the Jewish population, ending centuries of Jewish presence in the realm. Their properties were seized, their communities uprooted. For Edward, this was both a religious act and a political one, an assertion that he alone controlled the boundaries of belonging within his kingdom. Mercy was not his tool, control was. Thus, when Wallace rose in Scotland, Edward already had a blueprint for suppression: uncompromising war, followed by spectacular punishment. He did not see Wallace as a noble adversary, but as a dangerous rebel who threatened the order of Christendom. The Scots, in Edward's mind, were not a sovereign people, but a wayward province that had to be reminded of their place. His campaigns against Scotland bore this out. After Wallace's triumph at Stirling Bridge, Edward marched north in 1298 with overwhelming force. At Falkirk, his longbowmen shredded the Scottish schiltrons, those bristling circles of spearmen that had defied English cavalry before. Wallace's forces were crushed, thousands slain, and the Guardian of Scotland was forced into hiding. The English king might have believed the rebellion ended, but Wallace's very survival kept the flame alive. It is important to understand Edward's philosophy here. To him, rebellion was not merely an insult, it was contagion. Left unchecked, it spread. He had seen it in Wales and Gascony, even in England itself during his father's reign. Rebellion had to be crushed so utterly that it could not rise again. Its leaders destroyed not only in body, but in memory. That was why Wallace's punishment would go far beyond death. It would be annihilation,
a ritual humiliation designed to scar Scotland's imagination for generations. And yet, Edward's ruthlessness was not mindless cruelty. It was strategic. He understood the psychology of terror. He knew that a burning village could cow a valley faster than a garrison could. He knew that a flayed body displayed at a crossroads spoke louder than any proclamation. His reign was a lesson in the politics of fear. But there was also a flaw in Edward's methods. He underestimated the resilience of the human spirit when confronted with brutality. Each act of suppression in Wales, each expulsion or execution bred not only obedience, but bitterness. And bitterness, when it found the right voice, became rebellion. In William Wallace, Edward had found such a voice. A man who would not bend, would not barter, would not accept the role of vassal. Wallace was not simply a knight with a sword. He was a symbol of resistance, and Edward knew symbols could be more dangerous than armies. It was this recognition that sealed Wallace's fate. His capture would not lead to negotiation or ransom, as was often the case with noble prisoners. His trial would not be a chance for defense, but a formality. From the moment Wallace fell into English hands, his destiny was fixed by Edward's philosophy of kingship. The rebel would not only die, he would be erased.
After Falkirk in 1298, William Wallace's fortunes turned. His army shattered, his guardianship resigned. He became, once again, a fugitive in his own land. But though his political power dwindled, his legend only grew. Among the common folk, Wallace was not a defeated commander, but a symbol of endurance. He had stood against the English king when others wavered. And symbols cannot be hunted with swords alone. For Edward I, however, symbols could and must be destroyed. He tightened his grip on Scotland with castles and garrisons, each one a reminder of his dominion. He courted Scottish nobles with bribes, titles, and promises of security. Many bent the knee, some out of pragmatism, others out of sheer exhaustion. To them, Wallace became a dangerous complication, a man who stirred unrest when peace, however bitter, seemed preferable. Wallace vanished from the chronicles for a time. Some claimed he went abroad, seeking aid in France from King Philip IV, or even in Rome. If so, his mission came to little. The politics of Europe were entangled elsewhere, and Scotland's plight was not enough to outweigh dynastic rivalries and continental wars. Whether abroad or in hiding among the glens and forests, Wallace remained a marked man, his survival itself a rebuke to Edward's authority. The years that followed saw other Scottish leaders rise, men like Robert the Bruce, who would later become king, but who at this time played a dangerous game of allegiance, at times supporting Edward, at times resisting him. Wallace, by contrast, was uncompromising. He would not make peace with Edward. That refusal, admirable to his countrymen, made him an outcast among Scotland's nobility, who viewed his intransigence as a threat to their own fragile standing. It was betrayal, not battle, that finally brought him down. In 1305, Wallace was captured near Glasgow, most likely betrayed by Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had aligned himself with Edward. The details remain shadowed by rumor. Was it for money, for favor, or out of conviction that Wallace's resistance endangered the realm? What is certain is that Wallace was seized and delivered into English hands, bound and powerless at last. For Edward, it was a triumph long delayed. The rebel who had humiliated his armies at Stirling Bridge, who had defied his crown for nearly a decade, was finally in chains.
Yet Edward did not treat him as a noble prisoner of war. There would be no negotiations, no ransom, no honorable captivity. Wallace, in Edward's eyes, was not a knight, but a traitor, guilty of treason against the English crown. The irony was bitter. Wallace had never sworn fealty to Edward, and thus, by law, could not be a traitor. But Edward's justice was not concerned with legal nuance. To deny his sovereignty was treason enough. And so, Wallace was dragged south to London to face a trial that was no trial at all. The journey itself was theater. Wallace was paraded through towns along the way, displayed as a captured beast, his body a spectacle of England's triumph. Crowds gathered to jeer or gape, to see with their own eyes the man who had once defied their king. For Edward, this procession was as important as the execution to come. A rebellion defeated in secret could fester again. A rebellion crushed in public became a warning etched into memory. By the time Wallace entered London in August 1305, he was no longer merely a prisoner. He was the centerpiece of a ritual designed to extinguish the very idea of Scottish resistance. The stage was set. What followed would not be justice, but spectacle. A calculated act of terror meant to erase a man and silence a people.
On the 23rd of August, 1305, William Wallace was dragged before the court at Westminster Hall. It was the great hall of the English kings, a place of ceremony and grandeur. But on that day, it was also a stage. The outcome was decided before Wallace ever set foot inside. This was not a trial in the sense of law. It was a performance of power, a ritual meant to humiliate before it destroyed. The charge was treason. The accusation rang out in the vaulted chamber that Wallace had risen in rebellion against his rightful lord, Edward, King of England, that he had led armies against his sovereign, that he had murdered English subjects in raids across the borderlands. It was a script, rehearsed and predictable. But there was a problem at the heart of it. Wallace had never sworn fealty to Edward. He was no English vassal, but a man of Scotland, loyal to its crown, even if that crown was now exiled and broken. To charge him with treason was to twist the very definition of the word. Wallace himself, defiant even in chains, made this point. He denied treason, absolutely. He admitted only that he had fought against the English, but never as their subject, never as their sworn man. His voice, according to chroniclers, was steady. He would not beg, he would not bend. It did not matter. The verdict was foregone. The sentence was the harshest penalty reserved for traitors, that he be hanged, drawn, and quartered. To medieval minds, this was not merely execution, but erasure. The breaking of a man into parts, the undoing of his body as punishment for the undoing of his loyalty. It was also theater, each stage designed to be witnessed, remembered, feared. That same day, Wallace was stripped and tied to a hurdle, a rough wooden frame, and dragged by horses through the filthy streets of London. The jeers of the crowd followed him, a din of triumph and hatred. He was hauled to Smithfield, a broad open ground outside the city walls, where the scaffold awaited. There, he was hanged, but cut down before death could claim him. Still alive, he was disemboweled, his entrails torn from his body before his eyes. His heart and lungs were ripped free and burned. Only then was he beheaded, his corpse finally quartered, limbs hacked apart with deliberate precision. But even in death,
Edward's vengeance was not finished. Wallace's head was dipped in tar and set upon a spike on London Bridge, a grim trophy to all who entered the city. His arms and legs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, public warnings nailed above gates, rotting reminders of what awaited those who dared resist the king. To the English crown, the ritual was a success. A rebel had been destroyed, his body scattered, his name blackened in proclamation. Yet to the Scots, the opposite occurred. Wallace's defiance at his trial, his refusal to acknowledge Edward as his lord, and the savagery of his execution transformed him. He ceased to be merely a man. He became a martyr. Chroniclers hostile to Scotland sought to portray Wallace as a brigand, a murderer, a rebel who got what he deserved. But memory has its own laws, and the people who had whispered his name before now spoke it with reverence. Tales of his courage grew in the telling. His death was not the end of resistance, but the seed of its endurance. Edward believed he had extinguished a fire. In truth, he had fanned it. Within 9 years, Scotland would rise again under Robert the Bruce, and at Bannockburn in 1314, Edward's own son would watch his father's dream of dominion unravel in defeat. Wallace's body had been broken, but his idea had not.
The scaffold at Smithfield ended William Wallace's life, but it did not end his story. In many ways, that grisly August day in 1305 was the beginning of something larger, a transformation from man into myth, from rebel into legend. For Edward I, Wallace's quartered body was meant as a warning, a dismembered message nailed to the gates of Britain. But for Scotland, the message was different. It said, here was a man who had stood against the mightiest king in Christendom, who had refused to bow even when the noose was around his neck, who had endured a punishment crafted to shatter both body and spirit, and who had denied Edward's authority until his last breath. That defiance mattered. In the years immediately after Wallace's death, Scotland remained under pressure. Nobles quarreled, loyalty shifted, and Edward's shadow loomed large. Yet the memory of Wallace lingered. And when Robert the Bruce finally committed himself to rebellion in 1306, Wallace's example hung over the struggle. Bruce was a pragmatic lord, skilled at compromise and alliance, but the legend of Wallace offered a moral core to the fight for independence. He had proven that resistance was not only possible, but righteous. It was not only politics that carried Wallace's memory forward. Stories, poems, and eventually epics wove his deeds into something greater than history. The minstrel Blind Harry, writing in the 15th century, would give us the Wallace, a sweeping, if highly romanticized, account of his battles and courage. In those verses, Wallace became a knight of almost mythical stature, brave, unyielding, guided by destiny. It was less fact than folklore, but folklore has a power facts rarely do. For generations, Blind Harry's work was Scotland's national epic, shaping the way ordinary Scots saw their past. Wallace's legacy was not one of political success. He never wore a crown, never secured a treaty, never rebuilt Scotland's fractured nobility. His campaigns, while bold, ended in defeat. But legacy is not always measured in victories won. His refusal to submit, his unwillingness to be co-opted or bought, gave Scotland something rarer, a martyr whose life embodied the principle of freedom. Even Edward's cruelty could not smother that. In fact, it gave it shape. The horror of Wallace's execution seared itself into Scottish memory, turning his broken body into a symbol of a nation's suffering
and its endurance. Each limb nailed to a town gate was not just a warning, but a relic, a reminder of the cost of submission and the price of resistance. Centuries later, Wallace's name still resonates. His monument towers above Stirling, looking down on the fields where he humbled an empire. His story has been retold in chronicles, in epics, in novels, in films, each generation reshaping him for its own needs. To some, he is the patriot who died for freedom. To others, a rebel who challenged the order of kings. But to Scotland, he remains an enduring emblem, the man who, in the darkest days of conquest, refused to bow. The English chroniclers wrote that Edward's justice had erased him. History has proven otherwise. William Wallace lived on, not in flesh, not in crown or kingdom, but in the imagination of a people who would not forget. Edward Longshanks himself died just 2 years later, in 1307, on his way north to once again crush Scottish resistance. His bones were laid in Westminster Abbey, his epitaph carved in stone. Wallace's body was scattered, his grave unknown. And yet, of the two, it is Wallace whose name echoes more fiercely across the centuries. In that sense, the man who was meant to be forgotten became unforgettable.